welcome to our webinar around cash and commoning. This is a really important webinar topic for us. Really kind of cuts to the real fundamentals around commoning, which is how does commoning survive the economic pressures that it's facing now? Despite relatively good market prices, although fluctuating, really high, high input costs, real ongoing uncertainty around sources of subsidy and ELM, the phasing out of BPS and what comes after that, and ongoing economic pressures. These are, effectively these are quite difficult times for people. And how this session is sort of set up is almost as a kind of question and then an answer. So the first part of the session, we're going to hear from Tracy May from the Dartmoor Forest, who through the Our Upland Commons project has carried out a project called the Cost of Commoning, which is looking at the costs that are the costs to farm businesses of grazing the Dartmoor Forest. And I think what we will find is that shows a really significant issue that is facing people. And Tracy will be talking about that. And then hopefully the two talks that will follow after that will go some way at least to addressing those questions. Chris Clark from Nethergills will be talking about sweet spot farming and about how to maximize profitability, while also maximizing the condition of environmental assets. And then Bevan will be joining us to look at the Upland Farmer Toolkit, which is a toolkit that's in place to help upland farms, map for ways of mitigating the potential loss of BPS. And that toolkit is something that was started by the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, funded through the Lake District National Park FIPL, but that actually the Foundation for Common Land and the Our Upland Commons project is taking on now. So I'm going to hand over to Tracy from the Dartmoor Forest. Tracy, could you share your screen, please, and talk about the Cost of Commoning project?
Hello, I hope you can all hear me. So I've been doing this project on Dartmoor for 3 years, collecting the cost of commoning. So sort of to set the scene, where we started from was looking at the period from 2017 to 2022 of the farm business income figures for grazing livestock farms in the England LFA. And they make pretty grim reading, because they show a loss of over £11,000 per year for the agricultural enterprise. So these farms are dependent on other sources of income to achieve an average of 28,000 per year, which isn't a very high figure in itself. These figures don't include a value for unpaid labour. And also in the Hill Farming for England report from Newcastle University, they calculated the net margin for less favoured area suckler cows to be minus £394 per year per cow, and for less favoured area sheep to be minus £38.90 per year per ewe. So that makes pretty grim figures. On Dartmoor, it's a grazed landscape, and it's managed by cattle, sheep and ponies. And considering the previous figures and the loss of BPS, we were saying, well, where are we actually going with this? And so we asked, what is the actual cost of providing grazing animals on Dartmoor? Because any farm business income figures done by the government and other people for the whole farm, not just for the commoning side. So we sought to actually split out the cost of the animals that graze the hill, not the added value you put on them once they come into the home farm. So that's what this project's about. So we collected data from 15 farms, which were mainly mixed tenure with both owner-occupied and tenanted land. The total area farmed was 6,727 hectares, over half of which was actually rough grazing and the other half in-by. So 14 of the farms kept cattle and suckler cows. So they kept 2,217 cows in total, of which 69% actually graze on the common. The rest are kept on the home farm all the time. 14 of them kept sheep, which amounted to 12,624 ewes, 79% of which grazed on the common and the rest grazed on the home farm. 7 of the farms kept ponies, which was 291 mares, of which 95% grazed the common. Cattle and sheep don't graze on the common for the whole of the year, whereas the ponies are out all the time. So when we were doing these figures, we had to include estimates for when they were grazing the in-by and when they were housed for the winter. Where we could, where it was necessary, we used standard costs using data from the Farm Business Survey for the less favoured area, Southwest Farms. Variable costs are directly allocatable to the livestock grazing the commons. So we actually split down what went with the livestock on the commons and what was for the livestock that stayed on the home farm. The fixed costs were much harder to allocate to specific livestock, so we mainly based them on estimates. So for the cattle results, so on Dartmoor, most cattle only graze on the common from early May to the end of October. A few remain out until December, but they're all brought in onto the home farm and most would then be housed for the winter. So over the 3 years, the size and type of production was very similar. Fertility and mortality were very, very much the same. There was not a lot of change. The actual changes in output and input were due to changes in market conditions. Between 2021 and 2022, the costs increased due to inflation and energy crisis. So, everyone felt that. But especially the fertilizer prices went up a lot, and so did the diesel prices. This led to increased costs for homegrown fodder and increased machinery costs. In 2023, the energy crisis eased a bit and those prices dropped. So that meant the machinery costs were lower. The homegrown fodder costs remained as high because the consumption was actually higher. Market prices for cattle also increased in 2022 and again in 2023. So in all, the figures gave us an average 3-year margin of minus £325 per cow per year. So for sheep, on Dartmoor, they graze on the commons for most of the year. They come in for April and part of May for lambing, and again in November and December to go to ram. Other than that, they are out for the rest of the year. So over the 3 years, like for the cattle, the size and type of production was very similar. Between 21 and 22, the lambing percentage fell by 3%, but remained much the same in 2023. So once again, the changes in output and input were due to changes in market conditions. They were also affected by the energy crisis. So fertilizer and diesel, so that increased the homegrown fodder, but the sheep are fed a lot less than the cattle because they're not wintered in sheds. So as in with the cattle in 2023, the prices dropped, but the homegrown fodder remains the same as once again, consumption was higher. Market prices also increased for the sheep in 2022 to 2023. So overall, it gave an average margin for the 3 years of minus £16.90 per ewe per year. So looking at the ponies remain on the common all year round on Dartmoor. They only come in for a few days after the autumn drifts when the foals are weaned. So over the 3 years, the results were, because we've only got a small sample size with only 7, that means you have to be very careful interpreting these results because it's a very small sample size, and there's also a very large range in the size of herds between those 7 farms. In 2022, there was a reduction in numbers kept and fewer births, and also a reduction in the value of the foals, so there was a fall in output. 2023 was very similar to 2022, and you had an average 3-year margin of £7 per mare per year. When we were doing these figures, there's a number of general farming costs that weren't included in the results because we've just considered they were too difficult to allocate to specifically to the hill enterprise, to the stock grazing on the commons. Those costs can be split into 3 broad categories, which are your water, electric, and other general farm costs, which make up 55%. You've then got your bank charges and professional fees, which make up 25%, and a share in interest payments, which is the other 20%. So looking at the latest data for your less favoured area, Southwest Farms, the indication is those costs average £11,600 per farm, and 83% of that would be allocated to agriculture. If you spread that over the livestock units kept, this would give you an additional cost of £103 per cow and £10 per ewe. 2 other costs we didn't include were rent and fencing, because we felt that it was, once again, too difficult to allocate them accurately to just the animals that graze the common. So a summary of that is that over the 3 years, you had a margin of minus £325 per cow. If you add on the general farming costs, that's another £103 a cow. That gives you an average of minus £428 to compare with the general less favoured area figures for suckler cows, which was minus £394. For the ewes, you've got a 3-year average of minus £16.90. If you add on the general farming costs, that gives you an average of minus £26.90 per ewe, compared to the Hill Farming in England report, which gave a minus £39.80 per ewe. For the mares, we were unable to add the general farming costs because those would not have been covered under the farm business surveys. So this data relates to the farming enterprises as they are today. So if there's any changes to the management, it will be reflected in the margins. So if you want to remove the sheep in the winter or increase cow numbers or anything like that, that will change these margins. And you really can't use these figures as a model to changes in the farming systems, because everyone's setup is uniquely tailored to the needs of their specific farm. Although in general, they are carrying out their businesses in a very similar way, each farm is so unique that they each have their own challenges. We would really like to investigate how different significant changes to current farm systems would affect these margins. And we're looking to see if it's possible to do this using 1 or 2 farms as examples or case studies. So that's a very quick whiz through of what we've been doing over 3 years in this project, and I hope you find this useful.
Thank you, Tracy. Really appreciate that. That was really great to share. While I just ask anyone who can to put your questions in the Q&A. Sorry, I wrote in put your questions in the chat. It's wrong. Put your questions in the Q&A if you can. In the meantime, I did have a couple of questions for you myself, Tracy. I mean, I was just kind of interested about what reception you found that this report has and what kind of traction it's had, because I guess on Dartmoor, although, the level of grazing is always kind of controversial, there is at least relatively, widespread feeling that incredibly significant incredibly significant open landscape, incredibly significant archaeological landscape, significant sort of open habitats, that there does need to be grazing on and on Dartmoor. And we've seen through other projects that we've run about the significance of three animal grazing for biodiversity of invertebrates particularly, and everything else that comes from that. So what's the sort of response you're getting when you're saying, well, these are the costs that are being put onto farmers to provide that public service? Are people acknowledging that? I guess that's my question. And then also, particularly then, if you could also tell us a bit about the sort of take up of this by the Thurston review of protected sites in Dartmoor would be really interesting.
Okay, well, first, the results of this from the commoners, I don't think any of them were at all surprised by the results. They know what, when you take out BPS and everything, they know how these figures don't stack up. I think it's been a bit of a shock for some people outside of the farming community. Though a lot of them have seen the less favoured area figures, they know these animals are loss making. But there is, they want this grazing livestock on Dartmoor very definitely. I was at a meeting today and Natural England were reiterating, we want the livestock out there grazing. We need it for the habitats. So it's just, through elms or whatever other means there is of agri-environment agreements, we've got to get this money to be able to keep doing this. A lot of people tend to say, well, you need to fine tune your systems, you need to make them so, reduce your inputs and things. But most people have already done that. There isn't a lot of slack there that you can improve on. There obviously will be some, but yeah, I think most people have sort of just fairly, now what are we going to do?
Completely understandable, and I guess we do have some questions coming in the Q&A now. Am I right in thinking this did feed into the Thurston report?
Yes, it did. We only had the first year's figures available for the Thurston report, but that they were actually quoted in there and they did feed into it.
That's I mean, that in itself is really useful, I think.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to some questions from the Q&A. First question that we've got in there is, what changes are you thinking of testing with your sample farms?
Well, we would be looking at, two of the things, the recommendations that have come out of the Thurston review are to increase summer cattle grazing and to potentially remove sheep in the winter. So that's the two key elements we would be looking at. So it would be looking at, if you take the sheep off in the winter, where are you going to winter them? What is that impact on the business? What would the costs be? How would that affect the leer of the sheep? So would it mean that you would have to do more shepherding in the summer to get them to go back out where they're supposed to be, stop them drifting back to the edges of the common instead of staying up in the middle? For the cattle, if you're increasing your cattle numbers, then they've got to go somewhere in the winter. Where are you going to put them in the winter? So are you going to have to put up more buildings to house them? Are you going to have to buy in more fodder to feed them? Are you going to increase spreading fertilizer on your home farm to grow more grass to feed them? There are a lot of implications to the whole business on these changes, and it's working out what they would, what the actual costs, would be. Admittedly, there could be benefits as well, but it's seeing how that affects those margins.
Thanks, Tracy. That's really useful. Um, and we will watch really eagerly to see what comes out of the next stages of this. Couple more questions from the Q&A. One question: is there any input into the management of the commons you studied by the owners of the freehold of the commons? And I suppose, has that been taken into account economically in this?
No, there wouldn't have been anything economically put into this, because this was just dealing with the actual costs of keeping these livestock. The owners of the freehold of the common do have an input into the management of the common, and we do, on Dartmoor, we do work closely with the owners.
Thank you. And a further question was, how many of the 15 farms were in agri-environment agreements?
That's asking a really good question. I've got to remember who they were, because we didn't include any money from agri-environment nor BPS in those figures. That was just for the actual costs of keeping the livestock. But I think, well, all the farms would be involved in agri-environment on the commons, and I don't know whether they're in agri-environment on their home farms.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's useful. I mean, I guess with the figures that you're showing, clearly people are going to have to be having some other form of income, or their business is not going on, isn't it? Um,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I have another question. I just stopped at the bottom that says, figures show that the market does not pay for the public goods that Sam was talking about. Public money should be used to fill the gaps and provide an incentive to keep farming. Isn't that the point of the farming transition process? I mean, more of a comment, I guess, than a question. But do you want to respond to that as well?
Um, Well, yes, I think I agree with that. That public money should be used to fill the gaps and provide an incentive, but it's making sure that the level of money is enough to keep the farming going. Yes, if we're going to keep these livestock managing the commons as they wanted to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is probably also interesting, that would be a whole nother project, but is something maybe we need to think about, as we're actually, our Upland Commons that has funded this is coming towards the end of its sort of life scale of our funding, and we're thinking about, well, where do we go next? Is actually, is there a way of thinking about, well, how do you look at the value, the economic value to society of all of those goods that are provided through that management? Because what's interesting is that you've sort of looked at one side, well, what are the costs of providing those public benefits? Actually, it'd be really really interesting to sort of match that up, kind of, cost to the value of those benefits that are provided through those costs, as a
Yeah.
as a kind of another stage to sort of demonstrate what the value of this is to society.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I know there's been quite a lot of research on the value of these open spaces to the health service, because it's helping people with medical issues, people who are suffering from depression and other. I can't remember all the detail, but I know I've looked at reports on the amount of money. They've tried to work out how much money the benefit is. You've also got the benefit of the tourism brings into the local economy, and I was going to say something else and I can't remember what.
That's okay. I think it's been really, really fascinating and really interesting. I'm going to move on now and close the questions. Though, if people do still have other questions, by all means, do still put them in. We can still type answers to them. But I'm going to move on now to Chris Clark. Chris is from Nethergill Associates, to talk about one of the ways of thinking about an answer to some of the questions that are raised through this, looking at farm profitability through sweet spot farming.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us this evening. I'm a farmer. I'm also a businessman, and I've been advising businesses, farming and others, for 30 odd years. And while I was farming, I realized that there is a sweet spot, a point where farming and nature come together. But before I get into that, currently farmers are under fire. And this evening, I'm going to tell you why that is unfair, but also that there is a need for farmers to take back control of their businesses. You may well be farming, but you're in the business of farming. You run businesses. And what I'm going to talk about, the evidence that I've got to present to you this evening, is based around 300 farms, empirically, statistically, really significant. And in a nutshell, it's about profit, not output. So what is the role of farming? And I'm not going to concentrate on commons. I'm talking about the business itself. Yeah, I can't tell a farmer how to farm. What I can do is tell a farmer where his or her business is. So what is the role of farming within the UK economy? The role of farming is to produce food. It's an industrial economy that we live in, and so we need to produce food at maximum production. But that maximum production has to be consistent with profitability and protection of the environment. And this means working at a spot, the sweet spot, the MSO point, the point of maximum sustainable output. But before I get onto that, there are 5 farming realities that have to be taken into account. Firstly, every farm takes place and runs its business within a managed landscape. That managed landscape has been invested in to produce food. That's the first thing, the managed landscape. The second is every farmer thinks he's a farmer. He or she is a farmer, which of course they are. They think they produce food, which they do, but the food that farmers produce is a fuel. And that fuel is energy. And so everything that farming does is involved in is around energy. And farmers are subject to all the laws of physics and mathematics relating to energy. And you cannot get more energy out than you put in. Otherwise, you'd have a perpetual motion machine. We'll come back to that. So managed landscape, the food that farmers produce is a fuel, and nature only acts in a random way. If we want to dictate what nature looks like, there will be a cost. So managing to the sweet spot, managing to maximum sustainable output, will be the place where nature is optimized, not maximized. This sweet spot is where nature and farming come together. And it is really critical that we understand that a large amount of revenue that is generated in farming comes from nature, the free issue, from the sunshine, from the soil fertility, from the precipitation. So that's the fourth one. And the last one is that everything that farming does and that nature is involved in is driven by the sun. The solar energy drives all natural processes. And it is that energy that comes as free issue that we as farmers need to harness when producing food. When we try and substitute that solar energy with industrial-based agricultural inputs, fertilizer, feed, etc., it will always reduce our profitability. So that's a basic introduction, but just carrying on from energy, some interesting, at least I think they're interesting, some interesting points. Firstly, every square meter of your land, every square meter of this planet, when the sun is shining, has access to 1.36 kilowatts of power for every square meter. And even more interesting, that 1.36 is not a function of latitude. It doesn't matter whether you're at the North Pole, the South Pole, the equator, Dartmoor, Exmoor, Peak District, Lake District, wherever it is, there is available when you're in sun, that 1.36 kilowatts of power. It is not a function of latitude. And if you want to prove that to yourself, go out and look at a full moon. The picture on the right-hand side was what I took from my mobile phone. Full moon, there is no change in the sunlight on that moon based around latitude. It's called, the 1.36 kilowatts is called the solar constant. It's a standard term in physics. A farmer's mission is to capture this power and use it for maximum commercial advantage. You are, as farmers, in the energy business. And when you see it like that, things change. But interestingly, and this is why farmers should not be pilloried, that the farming industry is probably the most important energy producer in the economy. Farmers have access to over 220 million power stations of energy that comes down as solar energy. And so anything that we do as business people that own a farm, it is to make the maximum use of that solar energy. So I've spoken about energy, I've spoken about nature, and I've spoken about business. And I've spoken about the sweet spot, MSO, the maximum sustainable output. We need to bring these three elements together. And when we do that, and we understand why it works, we get to the maximum sustainable output. It is the point of maximum profitability for a farm. It is also the point where nature is optimized. It is also the point where the minimum amount of energy can be used to produce food. So how do we use these three elements, energy, nature, and business, in developing a farm business plan? So two types of costs, variable costs and fixed costs. We're going to concentrate on the variable costs, and the energy that is involved in farming are variable costs. Okay, and so there are two types of energy in farming, as I've already alluded to: the free issue, working with nature, the PVCs, productive variable costs, and they are exclusively using natural resources, sunlight, precipitation, soil fertility. And the second one is the industrial energy, the substituting for nature. When the grass has run out, we need more fertilizer. When we haven't got any more food, we buy and purchase concentrates, etc. So industrial energy, CVCs, corrective variable costs. Fertilizer, concentrates, for example, non-essential vet and med. So how do these fit into an upland farm? Well, I've got a set of management accounts. Now, we tackle farm businesses and any other business based on contribution, and I hope I'll show you why that's important. So we've got a 240 hectare sheep and beef farm. Their pre-support, like Tracy, we don't include support at the above the line, if you like. So on this farm, 133,000 of pre-support farm output. Now, if we go to the total variable costs, the total VCs, they add up to 57,800. Now, if you take that off the 133,000, you end up with 75,000 or thereabouts. Okay, so there's the first contribution. 20% of the 300 farms that we have worked with are negative at this point. So they might as well be pinning a £50 note on the back of every beast they sell, because they're losing cash without support. You then add in the fixed costs, and on this farm it's 83,000, and you take the 83 off the 75, and this is just reflecting what Tracy said earlier, there's a negative 7,800. Now, 80% of the farms, of the 300 farms, are negative at this point. Only 20% show a positive number here. You then add back in the BPS and the environmental payments, and on this farm, substantial, total support 96,000. And when you take the 96 from the 7,800, you end up at 88,500, quite a useful number, a really, really useful number. But take the BPS out of that, and there's a problem. Okay, so this is the standard way of accounts, the we present management accounts. So the first contribution is about making sure it's positive, and in this case, there's a 56%, the first contribution is 56% of the pre-support revenue, and the second contribution is a negative 5.86. The fixed costs here are 83,000, and they come out at 62%. The average is 65% on 300 farms. It needs to be at 40% for it to work. So how do we then bring in the nature side of this and the energy? Well, we then take out the CVCs, the corrective variable costs, the industrial energy base to a farm business. And in this case, it's 54,000. So we take those out. We take them out completely. It's not possible to do that. But in this example, I've taken them out completely. So instead of the variable cost being 57,800, they're now 3,800. And the first contribution goes to 120,000. So it's gone from 75,000 to 120. And second contribution has gone up from minus 7.8 to 37. And then we add back in the total support, and we end up with a third contribution of 133. So the industrial energy element of farming is causing a huge problem. And let me show you why that is. So here we have a chart from that same farm. And the yellow line is the pre-support revenue. And it ends up just here. And we've got the red line on the left-hand side, which is fixed costs. And the green line is the PVCs, and the purple line, the CVCs. So on this farm, they break even there. But then they've used up all their grass, and they start using fertilizer and feed. And suddenly you get this inflection point and a non-linear variable cost, and where they were in profit, they're now not. And we can show that because that other line is the conventional way of calculating variable costs. So when you look at the conventional way of calculating variable costs, there is no break even. They're only supported by the difference between there and there, which is what support is supplying. So it's a real problem in farming when we use these industrial energy elements to try and drive output. Instead of driving output, we need to drive profit. We need to drive margin. Okay, and on this farm, I go back one, the big margin is between, let me go down here, between there and there. And then if you add in the support, it goes down from there to there, rather than from just there to there. And what I'm showing you here is reflected on every single farm that we have looked at. It doesn't matter whether it's dairy or arable or upland or lowland. In every single farm. And so if you move to adopting a maximum sustainable output approach, your farm profitability will be maximized. The laws of physics and mathematics don't allow anything else. The pattern of biodiversity on your farm will be uncompromised, and it will be optimized. And simply by maintaining the MSO position, so not overproducing, not under-delivering, you will optimize the biodiversity on your farm. The total energy costs are minimized. You're producing food, which is energy, and by eliminating inputs with an industrial energy input, you are minimizing the energy costs that go into your farm. Your natural capital will be maximized. And we calculate your natural capital based around how much revenue your natural capital derives for your farm. And nationally, agricultural output will be optimized. There is a huge fear in regenerative farming that we are going to impinge on the food security of the UK. Two things to say to that. The current agricultural industry is not working. It's unprofitable. You can't have a good food security with an unprofitable industry. That's the first thing. The second thing is those farms that have gone to MSO are finding that their soil fertility is rebuilding naturally. They don't lose the amount of output that they think they're going to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I'm going to go, there was a couple of questions. I did have a couple of questions of my own, but I'm going to go straight to a question in the Q&A actually, which is, can you predict how much, kind of tails into what you were saying at the end, can you predict how much output would fall when a farm like the one in your example stopped buying CVCs, and do the savings in costs compensate for the loss of revenue?
So on average, a reduction, we calculate a reduction of something like 15 to 22% on average. Dairy farms are a bit less than that. And we had a beef and sheep farm this morning that was at 10%. So that's the average. So, but the MSO that we calculate when we first go onto the farm is never achieved. We never get to that point because the soil fertility rebuilds. And we did a project in North Wales with 37 farms where 5 of those farms had never ever used fertilizer. And yet their output, their dry matter per hectare was as good as the best of the rest, but their profitability was way above because they didn't have the inputs.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. I guess then one of the questions that I was going to ask, and maybe you slightly picked up on this in your answer already, but what's your experience of sort of working through this with farmers? Once you've got this in place, are you sort of mapping this through to kind of, you know, taking on your advice and seeing the changes to the farm businesses? Are there farms that you've worked through that whole journey with? I mean, particularly Upland Farms, with the interest of this group, and can you sort of tell us about that experience a bit?
So I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, but there has been an article written that'll go into Farmers Weekly, which will have an upland farm in it. And they are moving to MSO and have been doing so for a couple of, or maybe 3 years now. And their numbers will be published if it actually gets into Farmers Weekly. We don't know what percentage of farms are going to MSO. We don't follow it up in the way perhaps that we ought to. We don't have the time. We've done 300 farms in 5 years, and our remit is to make farms more profitable. But what we can't do is get them to make the changes unless they really want to. The other point to make is that there's quite a lot of family politics that goes on in farming. And quite often one member of the family would like to do it and other members don't. And so there's a dilemma there. What I can tell you is if we want changes in farming, in a farm business, and it's available to us, we always speak to the lady of the house.
That's really interesting, Chris. Thank you. I think I mean, a comment actually rather than a question, but from the chat saying, fantastic and fascinating and confirms my instinctive decision since headage payments were removed. And another question in the that I think was actually we didn't get time to answer was actually for Tracy's, but I think is probably relevant to what you're saying as well, which is, you know, will hill farming survive without BPS from your experience?
It depends what your definition of survive is. like Tracy, we haven't included any other income within the farming element. We want to know how the farm is working. It's looking like 1,000 to 1,500 acres is the minimum to be full-time farming. That's what it's looking like. So if you want to farm in the uplands with commons and you're not very big, you may need to derive revenue income from elsewhere. But please don't use that income to subsidize an ailing farm business. Make that farm business generate a contribution to the family exchequer, not a negative. And that contribution should be on a pre-support basis. If you can, use the support to improve the infrastructure. Make the farming business look after itself, so it doesn't need working capital subsidy from support.
Thank you. A couple more questions that have just come in. One is about, the relationship between what you're talking about and organic farming. I mean, the question is, does this mean organic farming is a good business option?
Organic farming, we have found no organic farm that doesn't have CVCs of some sort. Seaweed is a CVC. There's an industrial energy element to that. So, and quite often organic farms are using purchased concentrates. Organic, maybe, but still an industrial energy input. So every single organic farm that we have worked with has had CVCs. Are organic farms more profitable than others? Not always, but generally they will be. The profitability, the success of a farm is driven by the capacity and capability of the business person running it.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'll give one last question before we. Oh, actually, we've got maybe. Oh no, there's more. There's more coming in actually. So I'm gonna do a few more. So a few different questions. Just question here: what else falls under CVCs? Do you include vet meds? Do you include fuels?
Good question. So vet and med. Another really interesting question. So we split vet and med into PVCs and CVCs. So essential vet and med, which you can't get away, you have to have, is a PVC. Non-essential vet and med is a CVC. We know that on a pre-support basis, vet and med costs should be 5, 6, 7, maybe 8% of your pre-support. We have farms, so that's total vet and med. We have farms that are at 20, 22, and 25%. So the vet and med costs are a fifth to a quarter of their pre-support revenue. And those farms.
What's driving that, Chris?
What's driving that is, and I can't make a comment on what a professional vet would advise, except I can tell you what we're seeing in business terms. The cost of vaccines can be huge, and actually they're an insurance policy. The guy this morning the beef and sheep guy this morning was talking about how much he spends on antibiotics for foot rot. And when I said to him, what is the best way to reduce your foot rot? He says, reduce my sheep numbers. And of course, he's absolutely right. The worst thing for one sheep is another sheep. And just while we're on that, on a slight tangent, again, it's an average. And again, it's based on 200 and something livestock farms. But the least profitable farms that we come across, and this is not me spouting a view, it's just the evidence that we have. The least profitable livestock farm is all sheep. The next least profitable is all beef. The most profitable is a beef and sheep farm at a ratio of 60 beef LSUs to 40 sheep LSUs. Now that's an average. Yeah, we have some farms at 50-50 doing really rather well, but on average 60-40 beef to sheep.
And do you want to say what's driving that? Why do you think that's the case?
Because we think they graze and browse differently. The sheep clear up, that you get a better usage of the grass with the different types of grazing. If you have all sheep, they can wreck it. If you get all cattle, they don't make use of they make maximum use of the grass. A combination of the two seems to work the best.
Thank you. And I'm going to do a couple more questions as more are coming in as we ask. So one just really straightforward question. Are you counting lime as a CVC?
No, we're not. We're counting lime as a fixed cost. Why are we doing that? We count it as a fixed cost because it's changing the landscape, and it has changed the landscape for centuries. And you're only putting it on every, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 years. So although it is enhancing the yield, which you would have thought I would be against, it has been there for so long that the hay meadows, particularly in the Yorkshire Dales, cannot do without it. The balance between farming and nature has been established on some of the uplands, or many of the uplands, with the use of lime over centuries. So we currently use it, assign it as a fixed cost.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it is surprising, but does make sense when you hear it said like that. Another, I think, really interesting question, maybe more a question for a psychologist, but you may have insights into this as well, which is if purchasing inputs doesn't pay, why are farmers doing it?
Because when I went to college, I went to Silhane in Newton Abbot, Devon, and I was taught that to be a good farmer, I had to drive output. No one really talked about profit. It was how many lambs per ewe, how many litres per cow, kilograms dry matter per hectare, etc. The whole point in farming is that you are in business, and farming is going to go through some turmoil in the next few years. We don't know where support is going to be. At the moment, SFI, CS is all about 5 years of length. Farming is a 15 to 20 to 25 year business, not 5 years. So getting your farm to a state where you take as much support as you possibly can, but if it goes, you have a plan to be resilient and robust without it. I'm not sure I can remember what you actually asked me now.
I was asking you why are people purchasing inputs, which I think you have answered.
Well, so it's because we've been inculcated. DEFRA drive it, the fertilizer manufacturers drive it, the food manufacturers drive it, NFU drives it, and yet it reduces profitability every single time.
So it's, and potentially, I guess, also the complexity of people's accounts, where they are not necessarily separating out different sources of income, and then it can hide the picture that's actually going on.
Absolutely right. So at fault, as well as DEFRA, RPA, others, NFU, at fault also are accountants. So if any farmer wants to make a change to the way his statutory accounts are presented to that farm business, get the accountant to separate your support away from your agricultural sales and put it in below the line so you can see how your farm is actually working. Too many accountants include it above the line as part of the sales. And actually that changes the whole aspect of your profitability. And while we're on statutory accounts are not good for making business decisions. They're out of date, and the whole role of the accountant is to mitigate tax liability, not to increase profit.
Really interesting. We must close and go on to our next speaker. I have two. I know we have two more things coming in here. One was just saying, and I imagine the answer to this is yes. But are you, for hearing your passion? But are you passing this information on to agricultural colleges to influence the next generation?
We are planning an agricultural course with a northern agricultural college. But that's the only one.
And can you tell us a bit more about that, or is that still in process?
In process.
Well, watch this space then. Do let us know when that's up and running. And a last one there was saying, and this is interesting because I think this is something around, you know, what's looking forward and what's looking back actually, is a question saying, can the principles here be summarized by calling it moving back to what farming was like before post-war subsidies?
No.
How would you answer that?
No, it's not. It is partly. We got hold of a set of 1914 accounts for a farm, 72 hectares, no support. They had significant CVCs, not because of nitrogen fertilizer, but of guano being imported from Chile and Peru. They had 4 full-time laborers, and yet, with no support, they made more money per hectare, per acre in those days, than over 50% of the farms that we're dealing with these days. But what is different is that there is more science now, and we need to absorb that and take it on board. But we have to take it on board with proper farm management accounting. Sorry, I did one last thing on this. When you are advised as a farmer to undertake a particular regime, whatever it is, let's, for example, say mob grazing, please ask, what effect will this new regime have on my P&L account? Because no one ever asks it. And when you ask that of the advisor, whether it's a fertilizer rep or a feed rep, they cannot answer that question. And yet you need to know what effect it has on your P&L account.
We've got another question in there. Is there a report on your findings? We've got a
Yes.
couple of reports. I'm from your website. I will just ask Amy to drop those into the chat because we've looked through your website and harvested some links to your reports, which we can change. I'm going to close the Q&A on that now, but do look in, Chris, and type any answers to any more questions that go in. Fascinating, and I think we could go on much longer. So thank you very much for that. Bevan, who's going to be talking to us about the Upland Farmer Toolkit, which is specifically around addressing some of the questions that have been raised, which is perhaps why I haven't always been asking those ones around BPS, SFI, and the specific implications for that, because this is really around looking at how do you map the implications of how do you map ways to deal with loss of BPS. Thank you, Kevin. If you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, so what you should be seeing now is a very colourful slide showing what's called farming without BPS. Right, we're not going to go through this in detail, you'll be glad to know, but what I'm really wanting to pick up here, this was some modelling done last year by Julia Aglionby, who really has been the driving force behind getting the Upland Farmer Toolkit up and running. And what Julia did was some modelling based on the farm business income figures. That's this farm business survey, which is done for England for upland farms, where she has looked into the next 5 or 6 years. Now, the orange line is basically what is suggested might happen to profitability, farm business income, as it's termed here. Now, importantly, you can see that that's generally trending downwards. And what's in each bar, you can see it's made up of the kind of 4 income sources which farms have at present. The red bit is the BPS, and hey ho, you can see that that is ebbing away. The next one down is diversification income. The third one is agri-environmental income, and there you can see that that actually rises because, as we are seeing, obviously with support being redirected through agri-environment schemes, SFI, then that will rise. And the final rather important one is, of course, food production, farming, if you will. So, and we can see that just ebbing away somewhat there as well. Now, this is a projection, and really the point Julia was trying to make here is that with BPS ebbing away, that's clearly going to have a direct effect on profitability, and that backs up obviously Chris's previous session there. So if we go on to the next page, and this is just really a kind of silly picture, just really to say that we've got to deal with it. If you stick your head in the sand, well, the problem's not going to go away. So really, if we go on to the next slide, is really the opening shot of the Upland Farmer Toolkit. Now remember, the idea of this was we know change is coming, so how can we constructively help farmers to deal with it? And specifically, we're only interested in here in upland and hill livestock farmers. We're not, so this is targeted, and so there's nothing on arable farming in this in effect, and nothing on dairy farming. So what we wanted was effectively a one-stop shop so that people could pop in and find links, find tools which will help them, make the, these important decisions now going forward. So that's Upland Farmer Toolkit, nice and catchy, but once it's there, you should be able to find your way through to a lot of useful information, tools, etc. So what I'm basically going to do is quickly just run you through it. We're on to the next slide now, which is really a thank you to the people that paid for it, for the development. And as you can see here, it was helped, funded there through the PIPL project. And there was quite a number of people. FFCC took it on. And so thanks very much to all those folks, and in particular, Julia, for driving all this. Now, the next slide essentially shows the Upland Farmer Toolkit is split into three parts in effect. The BPS calculator, opportunities to deal with BPS, and how to actually go about developing a plan to that you can implement to actually deal with that. So first thing we want to do, and I'm popping on now to the next one, is we need to get a kind of starting position. And the idea here is for you to use your accounts, and as the previous speaker said, yes, they are historical, but they are hopefully a reasonably accurate reflection of recent performance, albeit it might well be somewhat dated, but it gives you a baseline. And in particular, what we're wanting to do is, what the tool does, is to give you a clear idea of what your BPS will look like over the next 5 or 6 years. So essentially, it's get your most recent set of accounts. Remember, a set of accounts will have 2 years of figures in them. And what we wanted to do is actually take the figures out of that and punch it into this tool so that we can project forward to give us a basic idea of what things will look like over the next few years. Okay, so hopefully we're on to one now that says step 2, add your trading output. What I've just done is actually there's a detailed calculator and there's a more simplified one. And so I'm just taking a snapshot out of the simplified one. Now you might say, God, that doesn't look very simple. But what we've got here is we have noted down exactly the things to look out. So agricultural output, you can see in your accounts the things you'd need to look for to include here. So sales of cattle, sheep, etc., valuations, that type of thing. The second, and remember this is relating to our kind of 4 income streams, the BPS, and what we've got in there is obviously the BPS figures, agri-environment and farm diversification to go in there. The little eye icons give you useful tips for going through this. Now, I wouldn't get too hung up. A lot of people, because the acid test here, because there's another couple of screens which will show costs. So there'll be a breakdown of costs into variable costs and fixed costs. So you plug those figures in, and if we go on to the next screen, this is the fail-safe, if you will. The net profit cells have got to come to the figures which are in your accounts. If they don't add up and subtract to what you see in your accounts, you've popped a figure in incorrectly, either in the output or in the cost. So you can just refer back and sort it out there. Now, that's a net profit. Now, one of the things you never see in a set of accounts is cash needs. And the cash needs of a business are critical because profit has to cover what you're going to spend on yourself and in terms of capital reinvestment. Now, that might be a loan repayment. It might be buying a new piece of equipment, directly or on HP. Okay, so effectively, cash needs is an important figure for us to bear in mind. Other things to take into account in some businesses, they might be other businesses which you actually, effectively that you live off. So that can be taken into account there. Some diversification businesses, for instance, are run as separate entities. And the last very important one is off-farm income. And in the uplands and hills, off-farm income, often with a spouse working off-farm, is an important factor in squaring the circle in terms of income. So we would pop that one in there. Now, if we go on to the next page, what I've done there is a very, very simple calculation, and just to show what the kind of page that is calculated. So, for instance, here, this business had a profit of 55,000 last year, 46,000 in the most recent year, and what it's then extrapolating, that bronze line at the top, is you can see that it's projecting into the future what's going to happen to profitability. Now, the important thing to note here, all we have simply done, other than the BPS ebbing away, is taking the rest as fixed. So it's simply an average of the last 2 sets of accounts and extrapolated forward. So really, all we're highlighting here is if nothing else changes, what's going to be the impact of BPS ebbing away by and fully gone by 2028. That's what we're showing here. If you go vertically down, what they're showing is where the profitability covers cash needs of the business. You'll note that it's net profit before depreciation because we don't want to double count, because depreciation is added back and then the kind of capital element is taken off in cash needs. You can see that this business in the most recent year has made a small farm surplus, but as you can see, without change, that's definitely going to turn into a deficit very quickly. So, in terms of, I suppose the one thing I would say there, if nothing else, if you think, oh, God, I can't be bothered actually looking, plugging all those figures into accounts, if nothing else, go in and use the BPS forward calculation part of it, because you just pop in your 2022 BPS and it will extrapolate forward what's going to happen to your BPS. So if you haven't already done that, that's worth doing. Now, opportunity. So the second stage is, okay, what are the opportunities then to offset the loss in BPS? Because unless you're exceptionally fortunate, most farms are going to be in the situation of having to do something about it. So effectively, then, we have got the three areas to look at: food production, environmental, goods and services, and diversification. So could well be a combination of those, and it very much depends on the circumstances. But what we're looking to do now is say, right, what information have we got to help look at exploring those options? So first of all, a quick look at a tool that we've got in there, because one of the first things as a consultant we always say to farmers is, well, is there any opportunities to improve current performance? And generally, there can be. So in this one, efficiency tool, it's a very neat little calculation that basically takes the relationship between the amount of weight or lamb weight weaned relative to the weight of the breeding ewes when they're at their fittest in the autumn. Okay, so you can see from this, and all you need with this, even if you don't know these figures, you can pop in and you can guesstimate, and it might stimulate you to actually think, I really should have a better idea of what the average weight of my ewes are, so you can do some weigh-in in the autumn. But you can see here, this is a flock with 1,200 lambs weaned. They averaged 27 kilos. There was 1,000 tapped, and a relatively small hill ewe was 55 kilos. So down the bottom, you can see there that 32,400 kilos of lamb weaned relative to 55,000 kilos of ewe weight. So just under 60% ewe efficiency. Is that good, bad, or indifferent? Hopefully you've now got the page, how does your flock compare? So what you can see there is we've done it for hill flocks and crossbred flocks, because you obviously might think, well, it's a crossbred flock, it's always going to be better. Well, not necessarily, because remember, hill flocks have got a smaller ewe. Traditional mule is probably something like 90 kilos. So basically has got to produce more relatively because she's a bigger ewe eating more. So you can see here, we're looking at the hill flock, and our example was 59%. So that's good, bordering on excellent. And so if you did this calculation, that was you, you'd say, well, actually, you're pretty good. You're doing a lot of things right. If the situation was that, there is room for improvement, there's a handy little kind of checklist which then gets brought up. And it really then kind of takes you through the type of things you should be looking at to see potential room for improvement. We did a meeting a couple of weeks ago with HDB, and Matt Colston of Lanco was there, and we were looking at fluke. And that obviously can have a massive detrimental impact on ewe efficiency. And, so if that's a factor, then you obviously look at the actions you can take to put that right. Now, the next one is looking at where environmental income might help. Now, certainly here we're just looking at income coming in from the new environmental schemes. But, of course, the environmental market, there is potentially income coming in from the private sector as well. And it's not just if we can think of some of the schemes for improving water quality, where some of the water companies will pay farmers for reducing stocking rate excluding. Now, that's income which would be placed in this income stream. But what we've got in Upland Farmer Toolkit, and I think what a lot of people think is probably one of the main beauties of it, is an easy way to get in to look at the various actions which are available now. So you can go into the calculator. Countryside CS, by the way, is countryside stewardship. So the other thing I should say at this point is that most people probably think of SFI rather than ELMS. ELMS is the kind of overarching scheme of which SFI is part of. But For most people, SFI is the thing we're interested in.
Are you there, Kev? I'm really sorry. We seem to have lost you there.
About that, hopefully you got an ice cream in the interlude. But yes, I think the important thing here is really just to point out you can probably give up the will to live trying to get through DEFRA's website in terms of finding the actions. So what we did here was just pull out the actions which we think are most relevant to upland and hill farms. The second column then gives you a nice simple click so you can get into the detail. So again, the idea is to quickly help you get in so you can have a look round. What you can then do is you can simply, if you think I'm going to put 2 hectares into CIGL1, then you pop that in and it gives you the rate per hectare so you can do a quick calculation about what it might mean. So that's the calculator, and very useful for you to surf around and drill down into the in particular actions. Going on to the next stage, so hopefully Sammy pulled up just developing a plan. The important thing here, and I'll quickly move on to the chap looking at the map. What we're trying to do here is help you kind of the overall thinking about how you look at making big long-term strategic decisions for your business, because you are making long-term decisions here. So think of it very much as like a map reading. You've got to establish where you are now. Remember, we had a look at what BPS was, current profitability, etc. Importantly, where you want to go, and that's very important because one of the things there is often in farming, there's a couple of generations involved. So it's not just Ma and Pa, it's generally as well, perhaps a couple of younger generations in too. So everybody there needs to be thinking where they need to be, and depending on which stage of life, that can be very different. Now, obviously then, in terms of where you want to go, there'll be various ways to get there. And I'm just quickly whipping through the signpost where you want to go. As I say, succession planning can be something which we get involved with there. The best way to get there, down the left-hand side, you can see broadly those are the options. You can continue with the current system, but as we've indicated, that's unlikely to suffice in most instances. But then there's a whole range of other things which you can generally look at. Going on to the next one then is kind of budgeting the options. And what we've done there, we've given an example, a worked example, just to show you the kind of budgeting approach to how you actually look at various options. What I've always said to farmers, what we want to try and do, the beauty of budgeting, is to try and make your mistakes on paper rather than reality. Okay, because so effectively the budgeting tool there helps with that. I'm on to the next slide now. I'm just skating through now, Sam. I appreciate you want to finish. Importantly, when we look at these options, it's not just profitability that we're looking at. Even though profitability is obviously important, you've got to look at, what's the capital cost of getting involved? If you've got to spend 600,000 quid on a diversification, if the bank manager is not going to support you and you haven't got that money, that's a showstopper right there and then. But there'll be other factors. Practicality. Have you got the skills? Environmental impact. Absolutely critical. What impact is it going to have on biodiversity, water quality, and climate change? Obviously, key factors and reasons why the SFI actions, a key reason behind them. And the final one is often an interesting one, is commitment. I've worked with farmers and they said, I don't like sheep, so don't come up with an option which says put more sheep on. So remember, we need to look for those. Deciding, and remember, there's probably several people involved in this, not just a single person. So how do we go about that? Well, a little approach to that is actually scoring those hurdles that we were talking about there on the previous page, and getting the individual people in the business to do that so you can then have a discussion. often as well involving accountant or consultant or a friend can help. And then, of course, there's a matter of staying on track, and that gets into the importance of annual budgets, etc., which is beyond the scope of this. So
I'm going to bring this to an end because of time, Kev. Because there's two questions that came in that I really just want to bring out the answers to. One of which I've already answered in the question, but I just wanted to have said in here, which was the question was, is the toolkit free to use? Which is yes, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's not trying to sell you a particular product or service either. So far, it's been entirely funded through, through kind of farming and protected landscapes, and now it's being funded through the Our Upland Commons project. So it's not trying to sell you something, and it's not trying to sell on or use your data. The other question was, what happens to your data on the toolkit? Now, Chris, I think I understand. Is that right? That actually the toolkit doesn't record your data, and your data isn't sort of taken away and stored elsewhere, and no one else has access to that. Can you confirm if that's the case?
Yep,
How
that's
does it
correct.
operate data-wise?
Yeah,
that's correct. So you're
the
not
data isn't
actually.
stored.
Yeah, so it works effectively as a calculator. So you're putting in data, you're putting in things into it, and it gives you answers, but it isn't sending those off and recording those elsewhere. So you're not sort of giving away your farm business data, which I can understand people are getting more savvy about the value and the risk to sharing their data. So I think it's really useful to share that. I'm going to bring this to a close because we're a little bit over time. I am really grateful to all three of our panelists. I think it's been really, really fascinating. If you're not already signed up to the Foundation for Common Lands newsletter, please do so. Please look out for us on Twitter. We will be having more events. If you're based in Dartmoor, the event that we mentioned around the use of the Upland Farmer Toolkit is on the 17th of July in Princetown, and Dartmoor Hill Farming Project will be sending out more information about this. Also, if you're down in Dartmoor on October the 18th, we have our end of project conference for the Our Upland Commons project, which is not just a sort of one of these kind of celebration, aren't we great kind of events. It's much more about saying, well, what next? We have done all of these different things to try and support economically and environmentally sustainable commoning, but we know there is so much more to do. To support the collaborative management of commons for the benefit of the public and others, and to support the farming systems that have created and maintained those spaces. So the conference is going to be, yes, about sharing some of the things that you may find of interest and of use, but also it's going to be about, helping us to say, what do you want us to address next? So please do look out for that on the Foundation for Common Land website. That is on the 18th of October in Dartmoor. And then there's another conference on the 23rd of October in Reghead in Penrith. So if you are sort of broadly southwesterly or broadly sort of northern, we hope we can, which are two of the bigger clusters of upland commons at least, we hope we can address your needs there. So thank you for bearing with us. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you for attending. Goodbye, everyone.